We all know that the British started off as a pirate nation, and they leveraged divide and rule in almost three-quarters of the nations of the world. And many of the problems that exist today are problems which have their roots in British divide and rule. But you know and I know that Karma, the theory of Karma, says that whatever you put out there will multiply and come back to you. And anybody whose mindset is comfortable with leveraging divide and rule in terms of international relations, it's only a question of time before, whenever they turn to every single one of their relations, divide and rule will apply. And so what we're seeing now is almost a feeding frenzy. It's like the sharks have all been let loose in the corridors of Parliament. And divide and rule, the cunning tactics which the empire used to build itself, we're seeing them in those corridors. And it's only to be expected if they leveraged sanctimony, they leveraged virtue signaling, and we're already beginning to see those aspects of the manner in which the British rule the world come here at home to roost.
People have been concerned that he still holds a green card, his wife wasn't paying the due taxes. So a lot of public are still in mixed minds. Generally, you'd think, how does the British public feel about having a prime minister of colour, of a foreign origin? Recently, there was a survey done by a think tank, British Future, where a third were perfectly happy to have an Indian or an Asian prime minister. Um, what do you feel the British appetite is for this change?
The Conservatives have always been very pragmatic. If it's good for business, they'll be happy to go along with it. If the person can get the job done, then there's a good chance that that person will be asked to do the job. They have still got some vestiges of clarity that one's origins do not dictate one's level of skill, that merit is not connected to identity, that these are to do with ability, to do with effort, to do with application, sustained over a long period of time. A meritocracy is a fundamental part of the way in which the Conservative vision has always worked. The left has to work on this. It's not consistent. They have not traditionally adhered to it, going for what you've said is tokenism, and indeed for tick box exercises. So there is a choice between the two. I'm hoping that what we will see is a movement towards the centre from both sides. And with candidates such as Rishi Sunak, with Sajid Javid, with Kami Badenoch, who is also, I believe she's tossed her hat in the ring as well today, with a variety of people, probably the most diverse pool from which a Conservative leader has ever been elected is now in front of us.
Jai Shri Krishna, Namaste, and welcome to Chitty Media's Current Affairs Show. Today we'll be discussing the recent reshuffling and changes that have been happening in the British Parliament. And to discuss matters further, we have our esteemed guest, Pandit Satish Sharma. Panditji, welcome.
Pranam Slonaji, Namaskar, Jai Shri Ram to you. Thank you for inviting me to speak on this subject. There's so much happening today, so much happening for the last 2 or 3 days, and I think it'd be really useful to share some ideas and perhaps even some background bits and pieces.
Yes, absolutely. There have been so many changes, and the British public, especially the Indian diaspora, we're wondering what will happen, because many are whispering that potential next candidate could be, well, Prime Minister could be Rishi Sunak. We have Priti Patel that is still in the wing. She hasn't put her hat in the ring. Sajid Javid is there. We don't know whether he will apply, but Rishi Sunak, who is our ex-chancellor, what do you feel about having a Hindu prime minister?
There are so many dimensions to talk about. You've introduced one or two of them. Let's just have a quick recap for a moment, if you would permit me. Boris Johnson has announced his intention to resign. He hasn't actually resigned yet. He's hoping to remain as a bit of a caretaker and run a transitional government so that the transition to the new Prime Minister occurs seamlessly and with the minimum amount of disruption. And his suggestion and desire has been received with caution in some quarters and apoplexy in others, where they're determined that he should perhaps leave sooner rather than later. But this is going to be smoothed out over the next couple of days. What it has done, though, is it started a process, and that process is the selection of a new chairperson for the Conservative Party, and that person would then become the leader and indeed the Prime Minister. So a lot of people have thrown their hats in the ring, and you're quite right. From our point of view, we have an interest in seeing what our fellow countrymen in the British sense, but also our fellows in that we share a country of origin, to see what their contribution, to see what they're going to put forward, and to see how well they're received. So yes, Rishi is on the roster. Um, Priti Patel, who is in the Home Office, the Home Secretary, she's not put her name forward. And I did read a letter that she had written to the Prime Minister, in which she says because she is responsible for the security of the country at this time, she is not going to put her name forward. Were she to put her name forward, then she would have to step back from her ministerial role. And so she's going to stay in office, and it's unlikely that she will put her hat in at any point. So that leaves us with two persons of interest. One is Sajid Javid, and the other is, as you mentioned, Rishi Sunak. And Rishi has, shall we say, he's got off to a flying start. I noticed that a website appeared today, and the domain name was registered a short while ago.
It was.
Yes, so there are rumblings that hold on a minute. He was registering domain names with his intention to run a campaign whilst he was still in office and whilst Boris was still in front of the liaison committee, in fact. So that's added a bit of spice and a bit of, shall we say, a froth to the conversation in the social media world. But from one point of view, it also shows a degree of planning and preparation.
Yeah.
When you've got somebody in a position of leadership, they should be always aware of multiple routes and options and be prepared well in advance of actually needing to exercise some of those options. So it's not a bad thing. On that note, though, I'm not sure whether you have seen it, but the social media response to the news that he's thrown his hat in the ring and that he has been planning for this for a short while has been mixed. Some
Mm,
people have applauded it, but there have been a significant number of people who have responded in a very negative fashion.
yes.
And I'm hoping that the unpleasant aspect does not really rear its head and that people judge it on the core merits.
Yes, people have been concerned that he still holds a green card. His wife wasn't paying the due taxes. So a lot of public are still in mixed minds. Generally, you'd think, how does the British public feel about having a prime minister of colour, of a foreign origin? Recently, there was a survey done by a think tank, British Future, where a third were perfectly happy to have an Indian or an Asian prime minister. Um, what do you feel the British appetite is for this
Hmm.
change?
So, a point of clarification, I believe that he no longer has his green card. I understand he had it when he became Chancellor. He was appointed to the Chancellor's role. And I'm fairly confident he doesn't have it. That would be just too much of a conflict of interest. You cannot have one foot in a nation, each nation on both sides of the Atlantic. It would not fly at all. But turning to your second point, the British population, the British public, I think the British public would not have a problem with accepting a person whose ancestors were not indigenous to these islands. I'm not quite so convinced that they would be happy and satisfied with these two particular people of Indian origin. And I refer to Sajid Javid as well because his ancestors too trace their ancestry back to Indian origin or
Yes.
Bharatiya origin.
Yes.
But I think these two, and certainly Rishi, I think there are some questions that need to be answered and some concerns that will need to be addressed. The notion of a person with a global perspective, one of the global citizens leading a nation, it raises some questions. You want somebody who's devoted firstly and foremost and primarily to this nation and the people of this nation, their well-being, their interests above all others. And there is a tier, an elite, who have a global perspective, and questions have been raised about their allegiance globally to any particular country. And so those concerns would definitely need to be to looked at. Um, we have heard rumblings about the influence of the World Economic Forum on a group of people who have been nurtured and who are in positions of influence in parliaments across the world. And it
Yes.
would be a shame for a person who is, should we say, answering to masters to be given such an important role. So there are very, very severe questions that need to be asked and good answers given. The new video that Rishi's supporters have put together has just also been released, and I must admit I was a little bit disappointed, but hopefully it will improve as the campaign proceeds.
Yes. And how do you feel that domestic international affairs would affect relationships with India now? Do you feel this will make a difference?
Well, Boris was a friend to India. Uh, as much as any politician can be. I think we must always remember that there's a pragmatic dimension to these international relationships. And invariably, what happens is the leaders of a nation will try and put the interests of that nation first. And then there is scope for a deeper relationship if the two leaders get on. And Prime Minister Modi ji and Prime Minister Johnson had a good relationship. I think it was frank, it was realistic, it acknowledged that the relationship hitherto sort of enjoyed by the two countries had some serious issues which historically caused a lot of problems for Indians and for Hindus and will need to be faced and addressed. So it was a genuine, realistic, and sober relationship. If Rishi were to come in, then there's an opportunity for all aspects of that relationship to deepen. And with Rishi Sunak on board, as a person of Indian heritage and Indian origin, there is even the potential to genuinely start to consider how we reconcile Britain's history as we know it with the need for reparations, restitution, and reconciliation. That
Yeah.
conversation needs to occur. Um, there were vast sums that were taken out of India, out of Bharat, many of them squirreled away in tax havens, many of them hidden away in palaces and museums, and there's no reason at all why, at the very least, people of Indian origin shouldn't be given free, unfettered access to all of them. I have a particular interest in many of the scriptures that were taken, many of our manuscripts that were taken, some of the ancient palm leaf collections. Um, there is somewhere hidden in a museum the Bhagavad Gita, which Bhagat Singh used to have at his side, and that was seized and has been hidden somewhere in the United Kingdom for a long time. All of these things need to be addressed. They can't really be brushed aside in the hope that they'll be forgotten. They need to be addressed, and somebody like Rishi could act as a very good catalyst for, shall we say, starting the healing process. Once that healing process has actually been concluded to the satisfaction of both parties, just imagine an Indo British relationship where the spectre and the harm, the grim reaper that has sort of always been present whenever a conversation about India and the United Kingdom is undertaken. Imagine that ghost being put to rest. That would be
Mm.
such a relief and a great way for the peoples of the two countries to move forward. So there is lots of potential with Rishi's appointment and Rishi's election. Let's see how it opens out. I think we're going to learn a lot more about Rishi Sunak. What we have seen so far is the Rishi Sunak who's a hedge fund manager, Rishi Sunak who's a consummate manager of finance and of econometrics and economic decisions and variables and factors. But that's not enough to be a leader of a nation. There needs to be a character. There needs to be a courageous shall we say, creative side as well. And I'm hoping that we will see more of that over the coming weeks. It's critical that we do.
Yes, no, absolutely. You've touched on a couple of really important points there, especially with the museums and the
Mm.
artifacts that are owed. Because, like, when I went to the British Museum, they had beautiful murtis there that should be in temples, in puja rooms, and it's heartbreaking when you see them just gathering dust behind a glass to be gawped at. Yeah, it would be wonderful. People are rooting for Rishi purely because he's Indian and he's a practicing Hindu. Diwali number 11, he put Diva outside, and we were all so proud of him. So let's see where this journey takes him, and us along with him. We feel there will
Mm.
be some change. And isn't it interesting that it's Labour who are always seen as left, woke, inclusive, yet it's the Conservatives that have had the most colourful cabinet, two female prime ministers, and potentially a next Asian Indian prime minister. What are your thoughts on that, on the differences of
Indian. I
Labour
know
and
you meant to say Indian origin prime minister.
Indian
You
origin? Yes, thank
know.
you. Yes,
We're in Britain. We have to be precise with these terms. Um, But you're absolutely right. One thing that's becoming apparent now, I think, now that our Indian origin community here in Great Britain are maturing politically, is that they're looking past the virtue signaling. They're looking past the marketing and the public relations issues to what is the substance, what is the actual policy position, what are the specific positions into which Indian origin and Hindu origin supporters are being placed. And there is, as you say, a dichotomy. I would add one observation, and that is the degree of pragmatism. The Conservatives have always been very pragmatic. If it's good for business, they'll be happy to go along with it. If the person can get the job done, then there's a good chance that that person will be asked to do the job. They have still got some vestiges of clarity that one's origins do not dictate one's level of skill, that merit is not connected to identity, that these are to do with ability, to do with effort, to do with application, sustained over a long period of time. And meritocracy is a fundamental part of the way in which the conservative vision has always worked. The left has to work on this. It's not consistent. They have not traditionally adhered to it, going for what you've said is tokenism, and indeed for tick box exercises. So there is a choice between the two. I'm hoping that what we will see is a movement towards the centre from both sides. And
yes,
with candidates such as Rishi Sunak, with Sajid Javid, with Kami Badenoch, who is also, I believe she's tossed her hat in the ring as well today, um,
yes.
with a variety of people, probably the most diverse pool from which a conservative leader has ever been elected, is now in front of us. So this is a journey that the nation is starting on. It's going to be great to see what it reveals to us about the reality of our British institutions and the British public. All of this will come out, and it's all down to Boris Johnson's decision, um, voluntary or not quite as voluntary as perhaps it could have been, to relinquish the reins and to hand over.
Panditji, with the British Parliament being in quite a mess, people are saying that they've divided and ruled the rest of the country, and now they're dividing and ruling amongst themselves. What are your thoughts on that?
You have put it so well. As a student of, shall we say, the national mind and how identities develop, we all know that the British started off as a pirate nation, and they leveraged divide and rule in almost three-quarters of the nations of the world. And many of the problems that exist today are problems which have their roots in British divide and rule. But you know and I know that Karma, the theory of Karma, says that whatever you put out there will multiply and come back to you. And anybody whose mindset is comfortable with leveraging divide and rule in terms of international relations, it's only a question of time before, whenever they turn to every single one of their relations, divide and rule will apply. And so what we're seeing now is almost a feeding frenzy. It's like the sharks have all been let loose in the corridors of Parliament, and divide and rule, the cunning, tactics which the empire used to build itself, we're seeing them in those corridors, and it's only to be expected if they leveraged sanctimony, they leveraged virtue signaling, and we're already beginning to see those aspects of the manner in which the British rule the world come here at home to roost. I'm really quite concerned because this sort of mindset can only be transcended with a great deal of difficulty. It needs to have leaders of character and leaders of very high morals. Personal ethics need to be apparent in what they say, what they do. And yet we don't have anybody on the scene who I think carries the gravitas to reset this. If I can draw a parallel, one of the reasons that our Prime Minister Modi in India is re-elected with an ever-increasing majority is because he embodies those characteristics. There is nobility, there is a tranquility, there is obviously no personal conflict of interest. There is an almost ascetic quality to the way in which he comports himself, the way in which he conducts his relationships. And you can see that this is a person of immense personal character and nobility. When a person like that appears on the scene, they can set the scene for everybody else to raise their standards. And sadly, I don't see that at the moment. Until such a person appears on the scene, I think we will see the knives behind cloak and dagger schemes beginning to have an impact. And it'll be unfortunate, but divide and rule, you're absolutely right. We are seeing it, and we will continue to see it, I think, until a new person has been elected.
Yes. Yes, no, I absolutely agree. We just have to wait and see now who that person will be. Thank you so much for your thoughts on these changing circumstances that are happening as we speak in Parliament. It's a dynamic situation, and I'm sure we'll be touching on this subject again in the very near future, Panditji. Thank you so much again. And are there any final words you'd like to say wrapping up this subject
Yeah,
today?
and this could well be the last conversation we have about Prime Minister Boris Johnson. So I think it's appropriate to just remember that in the last few weeks, especially, there's been a great deal of dehumanization going on. The vilification of this individual as a person has been sustained and has been most unpleasant for a long period of time. You know, we forget that this is a man, this is a husband, this is a father, this is a person with all the mortal foibles that we all have. And he has been under more pressure, I think, than any peacetime prime minister in history. He
Yes.
inherited the turmoil of the Brexit referendum result. He inherited the um,
COVID.
the economic impact of that. COVID then immediately descended upon the prime minister. We then had a period. I think he had a period of COVID himself, which obviously debilitated him. We now have the whole Ukraine scenario, and at the same time as all of this, we have the political Ides of March. The knives are always ready to descend, and so he has really had to toil through one of the hardest times. And I think it's worth recognizing that he achieved some extraordinary things which others could not do. You know, it took somebody of his determination and bullheadedness to drive through the Brexit decision which the nation had chosen. It
Yeah.
doesn't really matter about the peripheral aspects, because once the rules have been established and then a vote is conducted, the outcome is set in stone. There is
Yes.
no point at that point complaining about the peripheral aspects that weren't considered, etc., etc. And that he saw that this was a decision of the nation, and in order to protect the notion of a democratic vote, he determined to push through the Brexit decision. We remember the difficulties floundering through for 3 years, where there was no decision. Theresa May's attempts to, some believe, to reverse it. The turmoil that was caused by the Liberal Democrats and the Labour parties with their confused and varying positions on all of this. That uncertainty, that cloud that was literally covering Parliament, it was the only subject that was being discussed. This man, Boris Johnson, found a way to dispel that cloud and move the nation forward. That was a significant achievement that we should remember. We should also remember that for the first time in history, the Red Wall
Yes.
broke. It became blue. They were convinced that this is a person who they would like to entrust with the opportunity to level up. And I believe that had he had more time and the freedom to focus on these initiatives, then leveling up would have occurred. I'm fairly confident that he had selected a team to be able to deliver this. It's not a small achievement to be elected with such an incredible mandate.
No.
And he is handing that mandate over to his successor. That too should be recognized. So there are good parts and bad parts of every individual, but I think that history will actually remember him very well for the challenges that he navigated and took the nation through, and will forgive him and overlook what many really must agree are relatively minor misdemeanors. I know that any person who is on the receiving side of injustice feels it to be a major misdemeanor, but he has been, shall we say, found guilty of things which are relatively insignificant compared to misdemeanors that others prior to him have fallen foul of, and they have continued in their roles. Sir Tony Blair has received a knighthood for his services to the realm, and yet he gave us weapons of mass destruction 45 minutes before London can be devastated, and there were none. He took the country into an illegal war which devastated one of the oldest civilizations and drove it into the soil. That's a horrific act, and hundreds of thousands died, and millions had their lives and livelihoods shattered. And yet he has received a great deal of adulation. So I think that on balance, when we look at it personally, he had to go. The atmosphere was such that he had to go. But I'm not convinced that he is as guilty and as terrible a person as has been painted, certainly in the tabloids and in the newspapers and the media for far too long. So I think we should send him our best wishes, and everybody should be grateful that in very difficult times he did what he had tried to do. He promised, and has brought us into a different time and a different place. Hopefully his successor will be as clear about the need to protect the national interest and to genuinely create solid relationships based on mutual benefit with other democracies. He's laid the seeds for that, and hopefully that can develop in a very positive and successful manner. So I think we should send him our best wishes, and we look forward to seeing his colourful contributions in whatever sphere of public life, from the backbenches or elsewhere that he chooses to move to.
Sure. Panditji, thank you so much for your input. Much appreciated, and looking forward to our next liaison. Thank you so much again. Jai Shri Krishna.
Jai Shri Krishna. Pranam ji.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net.